Okay. Almost there. Okay, all right, we are live. Almost there. Okay, all right, we are live. Almost there.
Good morning, and good morning. Or shall I say good afternoon? I am so excited to see
Okay, all right, we are live.
We are so excited to see each and every one of you here on this afternoon for our Tuesday 12 noon virtual Bible study. Oh, we have a special treat for you on today. We are so excited because this week we are going to be talking about a very interesting, very interesting topic. Did you know the month of September is a very interesting month? Did you know the month of September is known as Suicide Awareness Prevention Month? That's right. That's right. The month of September is known as Suicide Awareness Prevention Month. I want to let you know some important statistics. Did you know every year, according to the Depression Project, and you can find them online at Real Depression Project, or their website is thedepressionproject.com, www.thedepressionproject.com. They report that every year we lose over 800,000 people per year to suicide. Every year we lose over 800,000 people per year to suicide. It's also the 10th biggest cause of death worldwide. Suicide. Yes, it's the 10th biggest cause of death worldwide. How about this statistic? 2 of the leading factors that contribute to suicide are isolation and feeling like a burden. Isolation and feeling like a burden. For the record, speaking up when suicidal feelings arise in your life is not a form of attention seeking. So much today in our world suggests that persons who speak up about their suicidal thoughts are simply attention seeking. And we've discovered that this is not true. This is not accurate. People who struggle with suicidal thoughts are not attention seeking. And just because one struggles with suicidal thoughts doesn't mean that one is weak. We have a myth in our society today that says, if you struggle with thoughts of suicide, in some sense, you are weak. And so we want to spend this month of September talking about particular mental health issues, and in particular, talking about the ways in which suicide, the feelings of suicide, are in some sense created or stemmed from trauma. Trauma in particular from experiencing a violent act. For more information on these statistics on suicide, again, I want to invite our studio audience to visit www.therealdepressionproject.com or www.thedepressionproject.com, and follow on social media The Depression Project. Their hashtag is break the stigma, hashtag break the stigma, and hashtag support saves lives. You can also check them out at Real Depression Project on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. So for our Bible study today, with the backdrop of suicide prevention and looking at the ways in which violence, unfortunately, causes persons to experience suicide, we want to look at a particular biblical story. We want to spend some time focusing on the plight or the violence experienced by Hagar. And I'm going to pause for a moment. Our own pastor, Reverend Dr. John Jackson, is going to give us a backdrop to the plight of Hagar and give you pertinent information about her story. So let us turn our attention to Pastor Jackson at this time.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Please excuse some of the clumsiness with the technology, but let me get right to it. Many of us know the story. We focus on the story of Abraham and Sarah, but there are stories within the stories. And one of the stories within the stories is the story of Hagar, who was the servant of Sarah. We're talking about a time period that the Bible is sharing with us where people had servants or slaves. And we don't know how Hagar came to be under the servitude to Sarah and Abraham. We know that Hagar was from the community or tribe of people out of Ethiopia. She was one of those Nubians, and so again, we're talking about Black people, period, in the Bible, because the Bible is about Black people and the journey of faith. And so we don't know through whether it was through war or what, but Hagar is in servitude, in particular to Sarah, but both Sarah and Abraham. And we know that that Abraham and Sarah have been trying to have a child all of their life. Here they are in their late stages of life, their 80s and 90s, and they get a visitation from God after coming out of the Ur of Chaldees. They get a visitation from God, and God says, I am going to multiply you. Your generations and your progeny will be more numerous than the sands on the sea shore or the stars in the sky. And we know that Abraham and both Sarah laughed. It wasn't just Sarah that laughed, but Abraham and Sarah laughed. So they were like, huh, this don't make no sense. Here we are, two old sticks gonna rub together and make some fire now. But, God said, no, it's gonna happen. And so they devised, because they figure out that they were too old to have children. So they devised that maybe God thought that it would be best for my servant to have the child. And because remember, now under servitude, what the slave or the servant had actually belonged to the person that was in control of them. And so they devised this plan where Sarah would be, an unwilling surrogate. We do not have the conversation. Now, if they had a conversation where they said, Hagar, would you do this? Be willing to do this? We don't know, because that's not recorded. And even if they did, it's kind of hard for a person that's a servant to actually say no. Of course you could, but you're depending on that person for all of your, all of the needs and whatnot. And so we look at Hagar as an unwilling surrogate because she was a servant. And so she then must sleep with this old man, Abraham, because he's well old. And it could be postulated that Hagar probably, was in her late teens or early 20s or whatever. And then she got to sleep with the old man. And she ends up having a child, Ishmael. And And once she has the child Ishmael, and I'm gonna begin to end it here. The Sarah, God said, I didn't tell you to do that. You weren't supposed to do that. He tells Abraham and Sarah, you run out ahead of me. I didn't tell you to do that. I told you y'all would have the child. And so God said, now I'm gonna honor Ishmael because he is a child, and he didn't ask to come here and all of that. But I am going to give you a child. You will have a child. They had Isaac, right? And so Sarah begins to look funny at Ishmael and Hagar, because now she got a baby, and now she want to make up some stuff that she looking at me funny and all that type of stuff. We don't know, but we do know that they were in the position of power, and so she goes to tell Abraham, put her out. Well, Abraham, at this point didn't have that much of a backbone and in his spine. So he goes according to what his wife wanted, and he puts them out. And so while they're out, and I'm gonna cut to the chase, God tells them to go back, and they go back, and then they get put out again. This time, the second time they get put out is when Hagar. And I love this part, though. Hagar is the only person in the Bible to name God, because she gets out there and God speaks to her and lets her know, I got you back. And then she names God at that point. So that's just a brief background of the story that we already know. And so I'm going to turn it back over to the good doctor, and then she can go into the nuances.
Yes. First and foremost, thank you so much, Pastor Jackson. There are a couple of dynamics that we want to highlight in this text. I want to invite you to check out. I want to invite you to check out a wonderful book called Womanist Midrash. Womanist Midrash. I hope you have your pen and paper handy. Womanist Midrash, WOMANIST, Midrash, MIDRASH. And it's by a professor by the name of Wilda, WILDA, Gaffney, GAFNEY. And Wilda Gaffney, first of all, suggests that Sarah and Abraham have an incestuous family relationship. They have an incestuous family relationship. Why does she say that? She says that because she believes that from the very beginning of their union is steeped in violence and trauma. What does she mean by that? She says most people don't know unless they've researched the text thoroughly and investigated the text. She says Sarah and Abraham were actually discovered to be sister and brother. Did you know that? Sarah and Abraham were actually discovered to be sister and brother, and they married each other. And she says this incestuous intra-family union seemed to run in their family, where they had relatives in their family who married one another. She says, and what makes their incestuous relationship difficult, she says, is the trauma starts from that very moment when the two of them, who are technically, biologically, and culturally related as siblings, decide to marry. She says this in itself breeds trauma or violence for anything in the future that would happen in their lives. She says, so it's interesting to note that they began to violate boundaries with the young lady who was a teen girl, if you will, who would later become Sarah's handmaiden or servant girl, Hagar. It is understandable, she says, that they would violate boundaries because they violated boundaries with being with each other to begin with, in some sense. And so first and foremost, this text has a lot of golden nuggets, a lot of Sankofa golden nuggets for us to reach back and fetch, if you will. First and foremost, it is important to examine what are the traumatic family relationships in our own families. I'd like to ask you to reflect on what are the traumatic and incestuous relationships in your own family, and how would you believe that those relationships that are traumatic and incestuous, how do you believe those impact you? Now, don't say that they don't impact you, because as we begin to study violence and trauma and their particular impacts around suicide prevention, we will discover that these difficult incestuous relationships sure do have an impact on us. So another point that this text reminds us of, or invites us to reflect on and think about, is what are the ways in which now that both Sarah and Abraham have decided to work within their own means to have a child and not wait for God to deliver an answer. What are the ways in which now they further cause more trauma, more violence by, in some sense, taking it upon themselves to do it their way? A reflective question for us is, oftentimes when we make decisions, we have to consider, have we consulted with God about those decisions? Or are we simply making decisions to meet our own desires and needs that don't have anything to do with what God wants for us and wants for our lives? And so the story of Sarah and Abraham causes us to pause for a second and reflect on the opportunity to wait. In some sense, if I can speak from a psychological perspective, in some sense, the ability to bear child during the biblical days represented faithfulness, love from God, and it represented a certain class privilege in society. And so, because Abraham and Sarah were not able to bear children yet, they began to wrestle with low self-esteem because of image issues. Yes, that's right. I said it, image issues. They began to wrestle with, there is no external validation that we begin to experience because we cannot show that we have born a child. Therefore, compared to our greater class system in the larger society, we must be low. And so another reflective question that this text asks us to think about and wrestle with is, oftentimes, why are we choosing to make certain decisions? Are we choosing to make certain decisions because we are comparing ourselves to other people? Are we choosing to make certain decisions in life because we are, in some sense, seeking external validation? We want to be a part of a certain upper echelon of society. We want to say that we are a part of a certain particular crowd, all based, if you will, on privilege, all based on class. And so, interestingly enough, we must begin to ask ourselves, what are the ways in which we become oppressive to other people because we are trying to be a part of a particular class? In some sense, Abraham and Sarah, in their zest, in their zeal to want to be a part of a particular social economic status by having children, take advantage and harm and oppress someone else. In this case, Hagar. And so a reflective question for us, I would have loved if a psychologist or a mental health therapist would have sat down with Hagar and Sarah and said, how do you all be at peace with not having children? from a psychological perspective, how do you gain peace around this so that you are not doing damage to other people, so that you are not hurting people in your quest to seek external validation from other people? We must also begin to ask that question of ourselves. In what ways have we hurt other people who were innocent bystanders because we sought to please another group of people that we wanted to seek favor from, that we wanted to be recognized by, that we wanted to be affirmed, by. We must begin to ask ourselves, how can we receive or push for or internalize a self-validation so that we're not seeking external validation from others and then hurting innocent bystanders in the process? Now, many womanist theologians believe in this conversation, in this particular story, that it was not Sarah's choice, that in some sense, Abraham pressured her to make this, for them to make this decision. But you have some critics say, no, that's not true, because the biblical text would promote that it was Sarah who went to Abraham and said, hey, have you considered lying with Hagar? Many womanist theologians don't believe this translation of the text, and they say, no, it's a couple of issues here. It's probably unlikely that Sarah was the one who actually created this plan. It's more probable that this was Abraham's idea. There are other critics who say, even if it was Sarah's idea to have Abraham conceive a child with Hagar, much of this is because still Sarah is the victim of a patriarchal society in which she herself is still a victim just as much as Hagar, and that she is willing to sacrifice Abraham being in a monogamous relationship with her for the sake of being polyamorous or polygamous for them to bear a child. And so, depending on the type of translation that you believe, you would have to begin to again ask yourself, the main crux or core of this lesson helps us to think about it. How do we become, again, confident in our own self-being, confident in our own value and worth, and not compare ourselves to other people, not simply make decisions that can oppress other people just because we are trying to, in some sense, hang out with a particular socioeconomic class of people. If we move further into the text, another point that we want to highlight is this text really begins to highlight a particular issue often not talked about. Often not talked about. And that particular relationship is the mother-daughter relationship. We will learn a detail in our Hagar story, the Hagar, Sarah, and the Hagar, Sarah, and Abraham story, that there is a particular dynamic that this story highlights that we often don't talk about. And that is the mother-daughter relationship. Even though Hagar is technically a servant to Sarah, they would have what we call a mother-daughter relationship. And when we think about violence, oftentimes in domestic violence, we think of, or in intimate partner violence, we think of the ways in which violence exists between male and female, with primarily male being perpetrator and female being victim. This text pushes us to think about what are the ways in which violence exists in other forms of relationships, in other types of relationships in our family. Domestic violence does not just exist between male and female intimate partner relationships. How do we redefine or add to the definition of domestic violence as also being that which includes violence between mothers, daughters, fathers, sons, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, and nieces and nephews, grandparents. And so in some sense, Hagar is a victim of violence, at the hands of Sarah, who in some sense physically assaults her, beats her up, physically assaults her brutally in a brutal, vicious manner. Because as she is growing in terms of her pregnancy and her stomach's getting larger, in some sense, this becomes a witness for Sarah, who again still struggles with low self-esteem around what she is not able to do, begins to see this growing stomach by Hagar and begins to have a little bit of envy, a little bit of jealousy, a little bit of low self-esteem, reminding herself of what she is not capable of doing. And so she, as a form of retribution, beats Hagar. Let's pause. This text also invites us to think about what are the ways in which we grow jealous and envious of people when it looks like they are being blessed or they are experiencing gifts, skills, talents that we are not experiencing. What are the ways in which we can grow a little envious of that? We can grow a little jealous of that. I want you to write this term down. In psychology and human development, there is an important phrase we highlight called cognitive distortions. Cognitive distortions. Cognitive distortions in psychology and human development are, in some sense, statements that we tell ourselves that are not true, that are distorted. Statements that we tell ourselves in our minds, meaning cognitive. Statements we tell ourselves in our minds that are distorted and not true. There are 10 types of cognitive distortions that exist. 10 types of cognitive distortions that exist. If you went to Google and you just Google, put in this phrase, cognitive distortions, there are 10 major types of cognitive distortions that exist. And one type of cognitive distortion that exists is called magnification and minimalization. That's right. Let me pause for a second so you can write that down. Magnification and minimalization. What is magnification? Magnification is when you take an entity that's small, that really is meaningless, that doesn't have value, and you magnify it and make it big. Similar to how a magnifying glass works, where you take a magnifying glass and you put it on an image that's small. And now all of a sudden, your perception, meaning what you see and perceive when you look through that magnifying glass, now shows that image as huge and big, when really, in reality, it's not. It's still little. It's still small. Minimalization works in the same facet. It just works backwards. It is the opposite of magnification. Minimalization is where there is a particular issue that's big, that's huge, and you condense that image. You perceive that image as small, as minor, as minute. Those are, that is a form of cognitive distortion as well. And what we would like to say in personality and human development, from a psychological perspective, that when Sarah sees this stomach of Hagar growing larger and larger and larger as she is pregnant with the baby who would later be named Ishmael. We discover that from a psychodynamic perspective, Sarah experiences a cognitive distortion, and that she magnifies this event. She begins to have a voice in her mind tell her, this is really big. This young teenage girl is carrying the heir to your beloved husband. This is huge. Well, we would discover later that no, this was not as big as Sarah was making it out to be. Why do we know that she was magnifying a small event? We know later that she herself would become pregnant again. If she had waited on God, she herself would become pregnant. And her child, Isaac, would be heir to the throne. And so in some sense, she is magnifying this event because she doesn't know what God is getting ready to do for her. A reflective question. Sometimes we worry and we magnify, again, creating this cognitive distortion. We magnify a something small and little because we believe that this is the only thing that's going to happen. This is the only thing that's going to occur. There's nothing else that's going to happen but this. This small, minute issue we blow up and make it big because we don't know what's on the other side. Sarah had no clue about what God was getting ready to do for her. So she focused all her energy, all of her mental health, all of her mental, emotional well-being on magnifying Hagar's small, little, insignificant stomach. And this is what causes her to commit violence to Hagar. I talked earlier about Hagar and Sarah represent violence that occurs in the mother-daughter relationship. And I want to expound on this point. So now, as a result, Sarah beats Hagar. Sarah physically, viciously assaults Hagar. And this text reminds us to reflect on the mother-daughter relationship. There is a wonderful, wonderful book that I would invite you to get called Mama and the Meaning of Life. Mama and the Meaning of Life by an author by the name of Irvin Yalom, Y-A-L-O-M, Irvin Yalom. It's called Mama and the Meaning of Life. Irvin Yalom is a psychologist who believed that everything that a person does or thinks, every belief that they hold tight to, every thought, every action that they commit is based on their relationship with their mom. Whether it's unconscious or conscious, everything someone does is based on their interaction with their mom. Mama dictates so much of life, according to this particular theorist. And so in some sense, this mother-daughter relationship between Hagar and Sarah becomes very challenging because in some sense, the violence that occurs between the two of them is indicative so much of the violence that occurs between many of our mothers and daughters today. I want to have a conversation that we often don't talk about. We often don't talk about the unhealthy violence of many of our mother and daughter relationships in our African American community. There are so many mothers today that are hurting their daughters emotionally and psychologically. Oftentimes for Mother's Day, we don't talk about those relationships. We don't talk about those relationships, but we have to begin to focus on or shine a light on or magnify this issue, this particular dynamic or issue of violence in many of our African American homes between the mothers and the daughters. And think about the ways in which that relationship really begins to impact daughters moving forward. And so this relationship between Hagar and Sarah really will have an impact on Hagar. It really will have an impact. It really will have an impact on Hagar. But womanist theologians say, let us not place blame on Sarah. Sarah yet is still a victim. She is still a victim to a patriarchy society. Womanist theologians say we would be tempted because Sarah is the one who is the oppressor. We would be tempted to paint Sarah in a bad light. But womanist theologians say, please resist that. Still, Sarah is a victim who is just acting out unconsciously because of the space and place in her social economic status and sociological role in society today. It is Abraham who is still working as a puppet master, maneuvering strings, if you will, and in some sense creating this skewed mother-daughter relationship between Sarah and Hagar. Also, please do not internalize this text as simply Hagar was getting quote unquote smart mouth or sassy with Sarah. Many critics have said, oh, you want to know why Hagar beat Sarah? Hagar beat Sarah because, you want to know why Sarah beat Hagar? Sarah beat Hagar because Hagar was getting smart mouth. Hagar had made a smart mouth statement to Sarah. But we have to be careful internalizing this negative belief because that was not the case. That was not the case. And we have to make sure we're not speaking myths about this text. No, it wasn't that Hagar had a smart mouth and made a smart mouth statement to Sarah. This really, really, really stemmed from the cognitive distortion that Sarah has made in her mind about Hagar and the ways in which her own sense of self-esteem around feeling as though society would still continue to invalidate her experience by now lifting up Hagar because Hagar has the capacity to do something that she herself, Sarah, did not have capacity to do. We really have to still not allow a narrative that says somehow Sarah was deserving of physically assaulting Hagar because of her mouth. We have to be careful. Let us pause for a second. What are the ways in which, as African-American women today, we are accused of desiring harm to us or allowing or causing harm to us because we are being sassy? We are always, as Black women, told that we are sassy, that we talk too much, that sometimes our mouths get us in trouble. Some of this is based on the myth from African enslavement of the way the Black woman was told she has a sassy mouth, if you will. This is based on the myth of the Sapphire. I invite you to Google the myth of Sapphire. Sapphire was a created image from African enslavement that really white European, racist white European slave masters created as saying, Black women are always smart now. And so there has been some desires to place a sapphire image onto Hagar and say, oh, she was being sassy. She was being smart mouth. She deserved for Sarah to beat her. And we have to understand that this was not the case. She was not deserving of it at all. This language is the language that we use to justify when our beloved sister Sandra Bland was killed by police a few years ago. We said, oh, Sandra Bland was being smart mouth with the police officer down in Texas when she was found dead in a jail cell after being incarcerated, is because she was being smart mouth with the police officer who pulled her over for a traffic stop. And so sometimes we use sassiness as a way to justify violence towards Black women. And we cannot do that. And so some reflective questions for us are, how do you resist the desire to call Black women as sassy, to say Black women are deserving of violence to them because they are being this mythological sapphire? Number two, how do you begin to see women who are also perpetrators of violence as still victims of the larger patriarchal society that has us fighting like crabs in a barrel against each other? This crabs in a barrel motif still shows that all of the crabs in the bucket, even though they're pulling each other down because they're still victims of a larger society that has placed them all in the bucket. And so in this, we cannot blame Sarah and we cannot blame Hagar. This text also invites us to reflect on, how do we not turn against each other when we are experiencing some low self-esteem, when we don't feel validated by the larger society because we don't have certain things that the larger society says is what represents wealth? How do we not feel invalidated by that and therefore turn towards violence against our fellow brothers and sisters? How do we not magnify certain dynamics and they create violent behavior towards others because we are, in some sense, taking particular dynamics to the extreme and therefore not thinking about others? Reflective questions before we close, reflective questions. And we're going to get into part 2 of this story with Hagar going into the wilderness and her conversation with the divine in the wilderness. We're going to get into part 2 of this on next Tuesday. But another reflective question for us is, are there some people you need to apologize to because you've been Sarah? You oppressed somebody because of your own low self-esteem, because of your own struggles, because of your own jealousy or envy of what they had that you didn't have, because you magnified, again, created a cognitive distortion in your mind that which they had meant that they were better and that you were nothing. Are there some people that you need to stop being violent to? Are there some people that you have been mean to and are currently being mean to, and you need to stop being oppressive? You need to stop being oppressive to them. I would invite you to reflect on that. I would also invite you to reflect on, are you in an environment where you are Hagar? Are you in an environment where someone who looks like you, talks like you, represents your same gender, your same ethnicity, someone is being oppressive to you? How do you speak your voice? How do you advocate for your needs? And don't just roll over in some sense. This text also invites us to think about our mother-daughter relationships, our relationships between each other as Black women. Are we loving on our fellow sisters? Are we loving on our mothers? Are we loving on our daughters? Are you in a positive, healthy relationship with your mom? Or are you in a positive, healthy relationship with your daughter? Are there ways in which you may hurt your daughter that maybe you need to go back and apologize to your daughter? Are there ways in which you may be hurting your mom that maybe you need to go back and have a conversation with your mom and say, how do we work together? Are there some sisterly relationships that we need to reconnect with and say, let us all work together for the good of our relationship and for the good the good of our community. And so I would invite you to ask yourself these reflective questions. What are the ways in which, instead of taking things into your own hands, you can wait for God? Because when we don't wait for God, when we take situations into our own hands, we create even larger dynamics. We create violence against our fellow brothers and sisters. I wish Hagar would have saw a therapist. I wish Abraham would have saw a mental health therapist. What are the ways in which we have to resist seeking external validation? Because external validation at some point, it'll wear out, it'll wear off. We need to have something on the inside of us that pushes us, that self-motivates us, so that we're not seeking external validation from others. Thank you very much, family. I have had a blast. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And we're going to pick up on our Hagar text again on next Tuesday. And we're going to specifically highlight now what Hagar does after being beaten by Sarah. She runs away into the wilderness, and we'll pick up right there next Tuesday.
Before we go, can I
yes, please.
share one? Diane posted on the chat line. She said, before my mother died, she confessed to me that she was very jealous-hearted, and she did not want me or my sister to be close to my dad. But she asked me to forgive her of the way she had mistreated me. Diane says, and I did forgive her, and we embraced before she died, and I missed her. She died last year.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing, my sister. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing.
You know, if as we get ready to close, as you were talking, I was thinking about so much of what you said about how the society that we are in, how we get so wrapped up into the standards around us that we begin to live out somebody else's reality with unreal expectations, which then create internalized feelings of not being enough, and etc. And it affects the unit. You know, we wonder how there's so much public violence created. It oftentimes has its germination point in our homes and in our moorings based on standards. So that sassy point, one of the tools of white supremacy, and many people may not realize this, but there are when Emmett Till was murdered, the white men that got off, they gave their report to Look magazine after they were, let go. So then they decided to tell what really happened. And one of the things they said was that Emmett Till was defiant, and so we had to kill him because he never begged for his life. He was defiant sassiness. And that narrative right now is what is pushed in Mississippi, in the area of Ruleville and all of that. That was an area where if the boy hadn't got, if the boy had not been so sassy, so this or that, he might have spared his life. There were Black people who were around the barn where he was being murdered, and they reported he was crying for his life. So I just want to add that in, that and then the living in an oppressive context affects all of us. So Abraham was also affected by the standards around him of what a man should be. This is the African culture, and unfortunately, unfortunately for Abraham and many that we know, they began to veer from, because many African societies were matriarchal. And Abraham then not having any children. Remember what this false standard is. If Sarah's barren, something's wrong with her. If Abraham can't produce a child, something's wrong with him. And what happened? He takes it out on her. And he's in the position where patriarchy helps him, but what we call it, status doesn't. So what happens after the incarceration of slavery? A lot of Black men, and this is not making an excuse, a lot of Black men are trying to be what white men determine is a good man. And in the frustration and in the hurt, I hear you talking about hurt people. And the hurt, the ones that are most vulnerable, our women and our children bear the brunt of it, because we're living out of somebody else's way of seeing things. This is so. I really thank you for going deep on this, because I ask us, those of us who go to Sunday school and Bible classes, and we get the high points, faith. Well, faith actually came through some very frustrating and some very hurtful things. And imagine yourself in the household of Abraham and Sarah. Imagine yourself in the household of Jacob. So as we look at it from above, let us also look at it from the inside. Imagine yourself as Hagar, as Sarah, as Joseph, as the people, who had to live that. And Diane also pointed out, Diane says, I also did a lot of praying, and it was a process, because my sister also mistreated me because she could not have any children, and I have 2 children, and I share them with her. She's a beautiful auntie. And Robert Gordon says, doesn't it matter how you say what you say? And then Diane says again, she's a beautiful auntie, but she was a rotten sister to me. Afterwards, we were able to sit down and actually talk to each other and get a better understanding, because I never stopped loving her, and my children love her very much. So yeah, those are just some of the comments. You're opening up so many areas here. So
thank you. This is fun.
Yeah. So again, you all forgive my technical inabilities in the beginning. I was trying to share the screen, but I forgot I'm sharing my screen instead of giving the host to Professor Buhuro so that she could share her screen. And so I'm sitting up there looking at, why is it like that? And finally I figured out, dummy, So we'll be better. I'll be better on next week. Dr. Buhuro is right on point, but I'll be better. I'll be a better assistant next week.
No, it's great. It's great.
Thank you so much. And so we look forward to next week. You all again read up on Hagar and Sarah, and remember the questions. I posted the books that Dr. Buhuro mentioned. I posted them in the chat line, and so I posted the term magnification and minimalization and cognitive distortion and all those things. And so you can do a little homework. This faith is development. And so you can do a little homework. You can Google, as Dr. Buhuro said, Google those terms and look up those books. And so thank you so much.
Awesome, thank you.
And with that, we are going to sign out. God bless you all.